The lights in the Grand Tech Conference Hall of San Francisco shimmered against the towering glass panels, catching the gold trim of Ethan Carter's tailored suit as he stepped up to the podium. Hundreds of eyes followed his every movement, reporters poised, cameras rolling, all waiting for the billionaire visionary to unveil the future of Carter Systems. He had done this 100 times before, owned every stage, dominated every room. But this time, something was off. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, faltered mid-sentence. A hand instinctively reached for his chest, his brow furrowed, his stance shifted, and then, without another word, he collapsed in front of the world. Chaos erupted in an instant. Gasps filled the hall, assistants shouted for help, MTs pushed through the crowd with urgency while a distant siren began to wail. Within minutes, Ethan was being wheeled out, unconscious, surrounded by panic and disbelief. The hospital room he woke up in was sterile and silent, with only the soft rhythm of machines breaking the stillness. He blinked slowly, struggling to adjust to the dull ceiling lights. His body ached, his mouth was dry, and the weight in his chest felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. A doctor entered, with a clipboard and a careful expression. Her words were clear, clinical, and final. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer, no cure, 6 months at best. Ethan didn't speak. He simply stared ahead, as if trying to mentally reject what his body had already accepted. When the doctor left, he remained motionless, the words circling like vultures inside his head. 6 months. That was all. He had built a tech empire, revolutionized digital security, outsmarted competitors, survived lawsuits and hostile takeovers, but none of that meant anything now. He had no wife, no children, his parents had died years ago, and his only brother, a Manhattan lawyer, hadn't spoken to him since a business fallout nearly a decade ago. He had everything, and now he had no one. Back at his Manhattan penthouse, the marble floors echoed beneath his feet as he walked in, loosened his tie, and tossed it on the nearest chair. Everything gleamed, the glass railing, the granite counters, the custom Italian furniture, but it felt hollow. The housekeeper greeted him softly, her voice cautious. "Welcome back, sir." He nodded, offering no explanation. Ethan walked past the living room into his study and sat, staring into nothing. The silence was unbearable, loud in its emptiness. Hours passed. The sunset melted into night. Finally, he stood and left the study, his steps slow, uncertain, until he found her in the hallway arranging fresh flowers. Amelia. The maid, 23, quiet, kind, always present yet never intrusive. She looked up at him, startled by his sudden presence. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked gently. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked as if seeing her for the first time. There was something about the way she held herself. Calm, but not cold. Innocent, but not naive. "You've been working here for 3 years, right?" he asked suddenly. She nodded. "Yes, sir." "Since you were 20? "Yes." "Before that?" "Cleaning offices downtown, caring for my grandmother," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, then gestured for her to follow him to the study. She hesitated, confused, but obeyed. He sat down, eyes fixed on the floor, voice low. "The doctors gave me 6 months. No treatment, no miracle drug, just time." Amelia's breath caught, her eyes widening. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up at her. "I don't want to die and be forgotten, Amelia. I want to leave something behind, something alive." She tilted her head slightly, unsure of where this was going. "I want a child," he said. The words landed between them, quiet but powerful. She stared, stunned, not moving, not breathing. "I want you to carry my child." Her lips parted in disbelief. "Sir, I've never been with anyone before," she stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of his request. He nodded slowly. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Her hands trembled. "I always thought, when I gave myself, it would be for love," she whispered. Ethan's gaze softened. "I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for trust, and the chance to leave a part of me in this world." Amelia stepped back, her mind racing, her heart pounding. "This isn't something I can decide right now," she said. "Of course not," he replied. "Take your time." She turned and left the room, walking quickly down the hall, barely noticing the way her knees shook with each step. In her small room upstairs, she sat on the edge of her bed, clutching a pillow to her chest, eyes burning with unspoken questions. How could she even consider this? And yet, something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, not with hunger but with grief, made it hard to ignore. He wasn't trying to use her. He was asking her for a final act of kindness. Downstairs, Ethan remained in his chair, still staring at the door she had disappeared behind. His heart, already fragile, felt heavier than ever. The house that once made him feel untouchable now felt like a tomb. He closed his eyes and whispered into the silence, "Please say yes, Amelia. Just one night. One piece of me left in this world. Something to outlive me." Upstairs, Amelia wiped away tears, the walls around her too thin to hold back the ache inside. She had grown up with nothing, lost everyone, worked for every dollar, but nothing had prepared her for this. Not the loneliness in his voice, not the rawness in his eyes, and not the strange truth rising inside her chest. The truth that, somewhere in the middle of this impossible request, her heart was breaking too. The next morning arrived quietly, with soft gray light seeping through Amelia's window, casting pale streaks across the worn wooden floor. She had not slept, her eyes red and dry from a night spent thinking, praying, questioning. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the same shirt twice, not because it needed folding, but because she needed something to do. The weight of Ethan's words lingered like fog, thick and slow to lift. She had replayed the moment over and over, the tone in his voice, the stillness in his eyes, the quiet desperation in his request. It was not lust, not power. It was a man drowning, reaching out with his last breath. Downstairs, the house moved in silence. The staff had been given the morning off, and Ethan had not emerged from his study. Amelia descended the staircase slowly, her heart pounding louder with every step. She paused in front of his door, her hand hovering above the handle. Then she stepped back. Not yet. Thoughts weren't clear, her feelings weren't settled. She needed space, but more than that, she needed understanding. She walked past the study, out through the glass doors and into the small garden tucked behind the estate. It wasn't much, just a few flower beds and a stone bench, but it had always been her quiet place, the one part of the mansion that felt like hers. She sat down and stared at the hydrangeas, their petals heavy with dew, and let herself breathe. Ethan watched from the second floor, his hand pressed lightly against the window pane. He didn't move, didn't call out. He had made his request, and now he had to wait. He had never been good at waiting. His whole life had been built on action, on strategy, on taking control. But now the one thing he wanted most was completely out of his hands. He turned away and went back to his desk, ignoring the unopened laptop, the silent phone, the untouched files. None of it mattered now. By noon, Amelia returned inside, her hair damp from the garden breeze. She went about her tasks with quiet precision, dusting shelves, wiping surfaces, avoiding the study. Her fingers moved automatically, but her mind stayed tangled. It wasn't about fear anymore. It was about meaning. If she gave him what he wanted, what would it make her? Was it mercy or sacrifice, kindness or surrender? The only thing she knew was that this choice, once made, could not be undone. That evening, after dinner had been cleared and the house dimmed into its usual calm, Amelia stood once again in front of Ethan's study. This time she didn't hesitate. She opened the door and stepped inside. He looked up from his chair, surprised but composed. She didn't sit. She didn't smile. She simply spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I will do it. Not for money, not out of pity, but because maybe, just maybe, I understand what it means to leave this world without ever truly having touched something that lasts." Ethan rose slowly, his expression unreadable, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her eyes locked on his. "I don't know what tomorrow brings. I don't know how I'll feel after, but I know I can't look away from you. Not now." There was no ceremony, no grand gesture, just two people standing in the quiet space between fear and courage. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. She didn't flinch, her breath hitched, but she didn't step back. Slowly he leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers, letting the silence say what words could not. When he kissed her, It wasn't urgent or hungry. It was reverent, like a prayer whispered in the dark. Later, in the soft glow of his room, Amelia stood in front of the mirror, wrapped in a cotton robe. Her fingers trembled as she untied the sash, letting it fall to the floor. Ethan watched her with awe, not desire, as though witnessing something sacred. She climbed onto the bed and lay beside him, her hands finding his, their fingers interlacing. He kissed her again, slower this time, and whispered her name as though it carried more weight than any name he had ever spoken. Their bodies moved with care, each touch a question, each breath an answer. There was awkwardness, yes, and hesitance, but also a kind of trust that neither had expected. When it became too much, when she gasped or trembled, he stopped and waited, his eyes searching hers for permission to continue. "I've got you," he whispered more than once, his lips brushing her temple. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I just want to remember what it feels like to be human." She nodded, through tears, letting go of everything she had feared, everything she had doubted, and gave him the only gift she had left. Afterwards, they lay tangled beneath the sheets, the room filled with nothing but the sound of breathing and the low hum of the city outside. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the unsteady rhythm of his heart. He stroked her hair, his other hand resting protectively over her fingers. "Thank you, Amelia," he said at last. She didn't reply, but her silence was enough. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted between them. She brought him tea without being asked. He asked her about her childhood, about her favorite music, her favorite book, her dreams. They laughed once, truly laughed, when he tried to cook breakfast and nearly set the stove on fire. It wasn't love, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was something tender, something fragile, something real. Then came the night when he collapsed again, this time in the hallway, just steps away from her room. She screamed for help, and he was rushed back to the hospital. The doctor said it was a complication, expected at this stage, but Amelia didn't leave his side. She held his hand while he slept, whispered stories to him, pressed her forehead to his, and begged silently for one more day. Back home, alone in her room, she stared at the calendar. Something didn't add up. Her hands shook as she did the math again. 2 weeks late. Nausea in the morning. The sudden sharpness of smell. She ran to the pharmacy in the rain, bought the test, waited in silence, then watched the 2 pink lines appear with a clarity that stole her breath. A child? His child. Amelia sank to the floor, pressing her palm to her stomach. "You're here. You're real. You're his." And in that moment, she understood. She hadn't just given something to a dying man. She had received something in return. Life hope. A piece of Ethan Carter that would live long after the machines went silent. The sky over Manhattan was an endless stretch of gray when Amelia stepped out of the hospital, her coat wrapped tightly around her body as the first drops of winter rain kissed her cheeks. The world moved around her with its usual speed, but her own steps felt strangely slow, as if each one had to be negotiated with the weight of what she now carried. The pregnancy test had confirmed what her heart already knew, and though she had told no one, not even Ethan, her body had begun to shift in quiet ways, subtle changes that whispered of new life growing inside her. But there was no time to embrace the joy, because Ethan's condition was worsening with each passing day. Inside his private hospital suite, machines beeped softly, the monitor steady but no longer reassuring. Ethan lay weak, paler than she had ever seen him, his once confident voice reduced to a whisper that only she could seem to hear clearly. He smiled when she entered, always, as though her presence pushed back the shadows clinging to the corners of the room. One morning she sat beside him, his hand in hers, and for the first time she saw the fear in his eyes, not of death itself, but of leaving without knowing if she would be safe, if their child would ever be recognized. He had asked her to open the drawer beside the bed. Inside was a sealed envelope and a small velvet box. "This is everything I can give now," he had said, his voice dry and thin. Inside the envelope was a notarized will, with her name carefully written beside a line that read, "Primary guardian," and the child referred to as heir. Unnamed yet fully acknowledged. She kissed his forehead, whispering a promise, through tears, that she would protect their baby, that she would fight for the name Carter to never be erased. That night, Ethan slipped into unconsciousness, and by dawn, he was gone. No final words, no final breath shared, only the quiet departure of a man who had built empires, but died with only one person to mourn him. The funeral was private, heavily guarded by legal teams and company executives who had already begun transitioning power, replacing his name on doors and documents. Amelia stood alone in the back of the ceremony, her hands resting protectively on her stomach, her eyes locked on the closed casket. Not a single family member spoke to her, not one acknowledgement. She was invisible to them. A maid, a rumor, an inconvenience. But inside her, she carried the truth they had no idea existed. After the burial, she returned to the mansion, now cold and half empty. Most of the staff had been let go. The board had already claimed Ethan's office and cleared out personal belongings. She was told she had 2 weeks to vacate, her employment formally terminated. She packed slowly, carefully folding Ethan's shirts, the ones she had laundered hundreds of times, the scent of his cologne still lingering faintly in the fabric. It was during this chaos that a letter arrived, hand-delivered. The envelope was stamped with a name she had only heard in passing, Mr. Richard Reed, Ethan's former business partner and mentor, a man once rumored to have been pushed out of Carter Systems during a turbulent restructuring. The letter was simple, polite, and brief. "I would like to speak with you," it said, "regarding Ethan and regarding you." The next afternoon, she found herself in a quiet corner cafe, her coat zipped high and her nerves raw. Mr. Reed arrived precisely on time, tall and silver-haired, with the calm energy of someone used to reading people before they spoke. He greeted her kindly, with none of the suspicion or arrogance she had expected. They spoke cautiously at first, about Ethan, about his final months, then about the child. She expected judgment, maybe even disbelief, but instead found something else in his gaze, recognition. "Ethan spoke of you," Mr. Reed said, "often, and not as a servant. He said you were the only real person left in his life." Amelia's throat tightened. She wanted to believe it, but hearing it aloud made the grief sharpen. Mr. Reed reached into his coat and pulled out a second envelope. "Ethan left this with me months ago, with instructions that it be delivered only if you were carrying his child." Inside was a trust agreement, a plan Ethan had drafted quietly, outlining a modest inheritance, guardianship rights, and a private fund to support both mother and child. Amelia's hands shook as she read it, overwhelmed not by the money, but by the foresight. Still, Mr. Reed wasn't finished. He explained that Ethan's death had triggered a legal battle. His remaining board members were challenging parts of the will, seeking to void anything that wasn't publicly documented. Amelia was not mentioned in any formal press, and the child, not yet born, would be the center of a storm that was already brewing. "I want to help you," Mr. Reed said quietly. "Not because I owe Ethan, but because I believe you shouldn't be left to face this alone." His offer was genuine. A legal team, resources, and more than that, his presence in court to verify Ethan's intentions. She stared at him for a long time, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to trust someone again. But something in his tone made her believe, and so she nodded. Just once. Weeks passed. Her belly grew slowly, visible now beneath the soft fabric of her dresses. Her mornings were still filled with nausea and fatigue, but she pushed through. Mr. Reed called regularly, updating her on legal filings, gathering documents, coordinating meetings with attorneys who spoke in terms she barely understood but tried hard to follow. He also visited, not always for legal reasons. Sometimes he just sat with her, brought fresh bread from a bakery, asked how she was sleeping, if the baby kicked yet. It started simply, a conversation here, a smile there. He never crossed a line, never hinted at more, but his kindness was steady, and in her world of grief and change, steady was something she had almost forgotten how to accept. One evening, after a particularly long meeting with lawyers, she fell asleep on the couch in his townhouse. When she woke, a blanket had been placed over her and he was gone, a note resting on the table. "Sleep well, Amelia. You don't have to do everything alone." For the first time in weeks, she smiled, not because she was in love, not yet, but because someone had seen her, not as a burden, not as a case, but as a woman still standing in the storm, still holding on. The courthouse loomed tall and silent against the morning sky, its stone pillars casting long shadows across the marble steps as Amelia stood quietly at the entrance, one hand resting lightly on the curve of her belly, the other gripping the file of documents Mr. Reed had helped her prepare. Inside, the air was still and cold, the walls echoing with footsteps and distant murmurs, but none of that reached her as clearly as the pounding of her own heart, steady, yet uncertain. She had dressed carefully that morning, a soft navy dress that covered her modestly, her hair tied back, no makeup, only truth and resolve written across her face. Mr. Reed stood beside her, calm and collected in a charcoal suit, his presence a silent anchor in a storm she was no longer sure she could weather alone. The hearing room was smaller than she expected, more intimate, but the tension inside it felt heavy, pressing down like a weight on her chest. On the other side sat two lawyers, representing the Carter Board of Trustees, polished and stern, eyes sharp with strategy, and behind them, the cold stares of Ethan's extended family, none of whom had ever met her, yet all of whom seemed convinced she was nothing more than a complication to be erased. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver-rimmed glasses and a gaze that saw through theatrics, called the session to order, and just like that, the battle began. Their arguments came quickly, with legal language and printed evidence, asserting that no formal marriage existed, that Amelia was never publicly acknowledged, that her child had no legal standing without a DNA confirmation and official registry. Amelia sat motionless as their words painted her as a stranger, a liar, a woman who had overstepped her place, but inside her, something held steady. She thought of Ethan's hands, how they had held hers that night in the hospital, how he had whispered promises not for himself but for the life growing inside her. She thought of the letter he had left, the trust he had written, the way he had looked at her with more humanity than anyone in that room now dared to show. When it was her lawyer's turn, he rose with calm confidence, speaking not with fire but with unwavering clarity. He laid out the timeline of Amelia's employment, the personal correspondence, the envelope from the hospital drawer, and then, finally, the paternity test, signed and verified, confirming Ethan Carter as the biological father of the child she now carried. He spoke of intent, of recorded voice memos Ethan had made in his final weeks, naming Amelia and the unborn child as his only family. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Reed asked to speak. He took the stand without hesitation, his voice steady and deliberate as he told the court about Ethan's final conversations, about the changes he had made in private, about the man Ethan became in those final months. He spoke not of corporate deals or boardroom tactics, but of a dying man seeking redemption through one act of hope. "I witnessed that hope," he said simply, "and I will stand behind it, because it was real." The courtroom fell silent. Even the trustees shifted uncomfortably, the narrative beginning to crack. Finally, it was Amelia's turn. She rose slowly, the quiet strength in her step more powerful than any testimony she could have prepared. "I did not come here to claim fortune," she said, her voice calm but thick with emotion. "I came here because my child deserves to know where they came from, to carry their father's name with pride, not secrecy. I loved Ethan, not for what he owned, but for the man he became when everything else was stripped away. That man asked me to carry a piece of him forward, and I said yes, not because it was easy, but because I believed in what that piece of him could mean." She paused, then added, "If I must raise this child alone, I will, but I will not let the world erase him or his father." The judge listened carefully, eyes unreadable. Papers were shuffled, laws cited, minutes passed like hours, but eventually the decision came. This court recognizes the child carried by Amelia Morgan as the biological and legal heir of Ethan Carter, the judge declared, and a trust is to be reinstated, as per Mr. Carter's private will and verified intent. A gasp filled the room, not from Amelia, who stood still, eyes closed, lips parted in silent thanks, but from the board, who realized they had lost not just a case, but control. Outside, reporters swarmed like bees, microphones raised, flashbulbs popping, but Mr. Reed shielded her gently with one hand and whispered firmly, "No statements today." She nodded and followed him into the waiting car, her heart pounding not from fear but from the sudden, undeniable truth. She had done it. She had protected her child's future, not through rage, not through manipulation, but through truth and grace. In the months that followed, the trust was established formally. her name entered into documents that once would have refused her, and slowly life began to breathe again. She moved into a smaller home near the Hudson River, quiet and sunlit, with a nursery she painted herself, soft greens and whites, each brushstroke filled with hope. Mr. Reed visited often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to talk, and sometimes to sit beside her on the back porch, watching the light shift over the water. Their connection, once purely forged in duty and loyalty, began to shift into something gentler. He noticed how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she read, how she hummed softly while folding baby clothes. She noticed how his voice always softened when speaking to her, how he never looked at his phone when she was talking. One evening, as summer whispered its way through the trees, he brought her a bouquet of sunflowers, awkwardly held together with twine, and simply said, "For brightness, in case today was hard." She smiled, wider than she had in months, and let herself wonder if maybe she didn't have to be alone anymore. The baby came on a warm morning in July, a boy with dark hair and Ethan's serious eyes. Amelia held him against her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks as she whispered, "You're here. You're safe. You are loved." Mr. Reed waited outside, pacing gently, and when she called him in, he entered quietly, then froze, his breath catching at the sight. She offered the baby to him, her hands sure, her smile soft. "Meet Ethan James," she said, and he took the child in his arms with reverence, whispering, "Welcome to the world, little man." Weeks passed, and the quiet rhythm of motherhood wrapped around her like a familiar song. One afternoon, as she watched Mr. Reed bounce the baby gently on his knee, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Thank you, Richard, for not walking away." He looked at her, eyes bright, then said softly, "I never could." She leaned in, her lips brushing his cheek, then resting there, and for the first time she let herself imagine a new story, not written in grief but in healing. Autumn arrived quietly in upstate New York, brushing the trees in hues of amber and fire as leaves danced along the pathways like forgotten whispers, and the wind grew crisper each morning, threading its chill through the cozy rooms of Amelia's home. Baby Ethan had begun to laugh now, that gurgling, joyful sound that softened every edge in her day, and Richard often dropped by in the late afternoons, sometimes with apple pie, sometimes with nothing more than his warm presence and the patience of a man who had long stopped rushing through life. Together they found comfort in routine, a rhythm built not on declarations but on silent understanding, on shared glances across the kitchen table and small gestures that slowly stitched something tender between them. Yet beneath the peace of her new beginning, a question had begun to grow quietly inside Amelia, not about love, not about motherhood, but about the shadow that still followed her name, the legacy of a man who had given her everything yet never had the chance to raise his own son. One evening, as twilight settled across the sky and little Ethan lay asleep in her arms, she sat on the porch with Richard and asked a question she had never dared speak aloud. "Do you ever think Ethan would have wanted me to move on? To love someone else?" Richard, ever thoughtful, turned his gaze to the horizon and replied, with a softness that surprised her, "I think he wanted you to live, to find joy again, not just survive. And I think if he saw you now, he'd be proud of how fiercely you've done both." Her heart ached at those words, at the permission they carried, because part of her had been waiting to hear it from someone else, to know that moving forward was not betrayal, but tribute. As weeks passed, their bond deepened in small ways. Richard began joining her for Sunday mornings at the local park, pushing the stroller while she sipped coffee, and sometimes, when baby Ethan fell asleep early, he stayed late into the night, telling stories from his past, tales of cities he once conquered and partners he had once trusted, including Ethan himself. Through these stories, Amelia learned that their friendship had once been more than professional, built on loyalty and vision, until corporate betrayal tore them apart. Yet Richard spoke without bitterness, only reflection, as though time had softened the sharpest edges of his memory. Then, one morning, everything changed. A letter arrived bearing the seal of a New York law firm, addressed to Amelia with urgent markings. Inside was a summons, not from the Carter trustees, but from Ethan's estranged cousin, a man neither she nor Richard had expected to reappear. The letter claimed a legal challenge against the trust, citing a clause about paternity that, if not reinforced with updated DNA results from the child, could void parts of the inheritance agreement. Richard's expression darkened as he read it. "This isn't about truth," he said. "It's about power and envy, and the kind of family that only appears when there's something to take." Amelia felt her chest tighten. The court had already ruled, the trust had been formalized, but this new challenge meant another battle, another courtroom, another moment where her son's legitimacy would be questioned in public. Worse, it meant facing a new round of whispers and speculation, not just from strangers, but from her community, from people who smiled in the supermarket aisles, but always kept one eye on the past she had tried to leave behind. She spent that night pacing, rocking her son back and forth as his sleepy eyes blinked up at her, unaware of the storm gathering once more. Richard called late, offering to drive over, but she declined, saying she needed time. What she really needed was clarity, not just about the case, but about him, about what they were becoming. The next day she visited Ethan's grave, something she had not done in months. She stood in silence, her hand resting on the stone, her son wrapped tightly against her chest, and spoke softly. "I miss you. I wish you could see him. He has your eyes, your stubborn little frown, but I think you already knew that." She paused, the wind catching the ends of her scarf. "I think I'm falling for him, Richard, and I don't know if that's wrong or right, but I wanted you to know I'll never forget you, but I also need to keep living. And maybe love isn't meant to be a single chapter. Maybe it's the whole book." As she walked back to her car, a sense of peace settled over her. She couldn't control what others believed, couldn't undo the losses she had endured, but she could choose what to carry forward and what to leave behind. Richard was waiting on her front porch when she returned, a look of concern etched across his face. She didn't wait for him to speak. She stepped forward and kissed him, not urgently, not fearfully, but with quiet certainty. His hands found hers, their fingers locking naturally, and in that moment something shifted permanently. The next few weeks moved quickly. Richard took control of the legal preparation, coordinating with the same team who had helped before. Amelia remained calm, focused, no longer the woman who had once been afraid of her own shadow, but a mother who now knew her worth and the value of the story she was protecting. At the final hearing, the courtroom was tense, filled with representatives, media, and even some of the trustees once again, watching to see if Amelia would fall. But she didn't. With her son in her arms and Richard beside her, she presented the new DNA results, unquestionable and absolute. The judge, the same woman who had ruled months before, leaned back in her chair and said clearly, "This court sees no reason to reopen a settled matter. The child remains the recognized heir, and the trust stands firm." Outside, Richard turned to her with a slow smile. "That's twice now you've stared down giants and didn't blink." Amelia laughed, the sound light and full, her eyes shining with something new. "I didn't do it alone," she said. Back at home, she tucked her son into his crib, pressed a kiss to his forehead, and stood in the nursery doorway as Richard entered behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist and said softly, "We're not just surviving anymore. We're building something." She turned to face him and replied, "Then let's build it together." Winter returned with quiet grace, soft snowflakes drifting like forgotten wishes over the rooftops as Amelia pushed the stroller along the quiet suburban sidewalk, her scarf wrapped tight against the wind, and baby Ethan sleeping peacefully inside his cozy cocoon of blankets, the world around her blanketed in white stillness. Yet her heart had begun to stir with something far louder than the seasoned questions she hadn't asked, truths that had been left unsaid, and memories that refused to stay buried. It began with a phone call, unexpected and brief, from a number she didn't recognize, a man's voice speaking her name with familiarity she couldn't place, asking to meet, claiming to have something she deserved to know. She almost hung up, but something in his tone, a mix of regret and urgency, made her pause, and that's how she found herself sitting at a quiet booth in a Brooklyn diner 2 days later, facing a man named Calvin Rhodes, Ethan's former legal advisor, who had disappeared from the Carter circle long before the inheritance battle had begun. He looked older than his age, worn down by guilt, and before she could ask why he'd come, he slid a folder across the table and said softly, "You need to read this, not because I want to hurt you, but because Ethan wanted you to know everything." Inside were documents she didn't recognize, handwritten letters, some addressed to Ethan, others never sent, and at the very bottom, a photograph, grainy and folded, of Ethan and another woman, younger, smiling, her heart stilled as she looked at it. "This isn't what you think," Calvin said quickly. "That child was never born. She lost it before delivery and the relationship ended badly, but Ethan blamed himself for years. That's why he never rushed anything with you. He carried this guilt, thought he didn't deserve happiness again, but you changed that. He left these with me before the surgery, said if something happened, you should have the truth." Amelia sat in stunned silence, unsure what to feel: betrayal, sorrow, empathy, or simply the weight of knowing that Ethan had suffered silently even while giving her everything. She thanked Calvin quietly, took the folder and walked out into the snow, her thoughts a flurry of memory and doubt. That night, after putting the baby to sleep, she sat in the living room with Richard, the fire glowing gently between them, and told him everything. He listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving hers, and when she finished he said, "Truth doesn't erase love, it only deepens it. If anything, this makes what you two had even more real. You helped him heal, Amelia. That matters." She reached for his hand, grateful, but her mind was still turning. Over the next few days she read the letters in fragments, each one a window into a version of Ethan she had only glimpsed, vulnerable, afraid, desperate to redeem something he thought he had lost forever. He had never told her about the child he once almost had, or the woman who vanished from his life, but now with every word, Amelia saw the pattern more clearly. Ethan had loved fiercely, but carried his wounds quietly, and in her he had found not just affection, but redemption. That realization lifted something from her chest, something heavy she hadn't even known was there. Still, not all secrets stay buried peacefully. One morning, while preparing breakfast, she received a visit from an unexpected guest, Ethan's aunt, a woman she had only seen once at the court hearings, elegantly dressed, eyes sharp and guarded. She requested a private word, and Amelia, surprised but composed, invited her inside. "I came because I owe you an apology," the woman said bluntly. "Not for the legal battle. I believed what I was told, but for assuming you were just some girl with a story. I've been watching from afar, and I see now how wrong I was. You've handled everything with more grace than most of us ever did." She paused, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. "Ethan bought this a week before the surgery," she said, holding it out. "He asked me to keep it just in case, and I think it's time it went to you." Amelia opened the box slowly, revealing a delicate gold necklace with a tiny sapphire pendant, the birthstone of September, her birth month. Inside the lid was a small engraving, "A future worth choosing." She blinked hard, the words catching in her throat. After the woman left, she sat alone in the kitchen, the box resting in her palm, and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of being seen, of being valued by someone who had once refused to acknowledge her. Later that evening, she shared the story with Richard, who listened quietly before standing and walking to her, lifting the necklace gently from its case and fastening it around her neck. "You don't need this to prove anything," he said, "but it's beautiful, and so are you." As his hands brushed her skin, a wave of warmth spread through her, a sense that this home, this man, this new life, they were not replacements for what she had lost, but extensions of it, new pages in a book still being written. As Christmas approached, the house transformed with soft lights, garlands of pine and cinnamon-scented candles. Amelia decorated the tree with Richard and baby Ethan, tiny ornaments dangling from the lower branches where his little hands could reach. On Christmas Eve, the three of them sat by the fire, a quiet moment shared with cocoa and laughter. Richard turned to her then and asked softly, "What do you see when you look at us?" She didn't hesitate. "I see the future Ethan wanted for his son, and the life I never thought I'd find again." A New Year's morning, with snow piled high on the windowsill and silence draped gently across the neighborhood, Amelia woke to find Richard already in the nursery, rocking baby Ethan and humming a lullaby she didn't recognize. She watched from the doorway for a moment, her heart full and steady. Then he turned, met her eyes, and said without fanfare, "I love him like he's mine, and I love you like I always will." She stepped forward, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "Then let's stop waiting. Let's write the rest of this story together." As the last days of winter melted into spring, the air began to carry a new scent, not just of thawing earth and blooming daffodils, but of change that was no longer waiting quietly at the door. And in Amelia's home, the walls seemed to breathe differently, filled with the hum of something unfinished, but full of promise. Richard had begun to spend more nights at the house, not because he had to, but because being there had slowly become his peace, a contrast to the sharp lines of his old life, and each morning they fell into a quiet dance of caring for Ethan, sharing smiles over coffee and small touches that meant more than either dared to say aloud. Yet for all the warmth that surrounded them, Amelia felt a growing tension tugging at her chest, not from fear of the future, but from the weight of a decision she knew would soon have to be made. One evening, as the sky darkened into a velvet blue and the sound of crickets returned to the air, Amelia sat on the front steps of the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees with baby Ethan in her arms and Richard beside her, his shoulder brushing hers softly, the silence between them deeper than words. He looked at her then, with an expression she had come to recognize, one filled with careful patience and quiet hope, and finally he spoke. "I've been holding back not because I don't know what I want, but because I wanted you to be ready. And now I need to ask, Amelia, is this still a beginning, or is it time to call it home?" She didn't answer at first, her eyes on the sleeping boy in her arms, but in her chest her heart stirred with a truth she could no longer deny. The past had shaped her, yes, and Ethan would always be part of her story, but she had stopped waking with grief, stopped holding her breath around joy, and she had started dreaming again, not of a man who was gone, but of a man who had stayed. Richard. She looked at him, her lips parting but no words coming. Not yet. Instead, she leaned in, rested her forehead against his, and whispered, "I'm almost there, I promise." He nodded slowly, no pressure in his touch, only understanding, and together they watched the stars appear one by one. But peace is rarely left untouched. The next morning brought another unexpected twist, a letter delivered not by post but in person, by a woman Amelia had never seen before, dressed in a gray suit, her eyes sharp and distant. She introduced herself as a representative of the Carter Foundation's Legacy Division, stating that Ethan's will had included an addendum that had only recently surfaced due to archival delays. A private request, unrelated to finances, but to guardianship. Amelia's hands trembled as she unfolded the document inside. It was Ethan's handwriting, unmistakable, and it stated that in the event of his death and Amelia's inability to provide for the child, he wished for his closest friend and business partner, Richard Reed, to assume joint guardianship of the baby. The implications hit her like a wave. Ethan had trusted Richard not just as a colleague, but as a father figure, someone he believed would raise his son with love, if she ever could not. It was a message from beyond the grave, a silent blessing on what they had begun building together. That night, Amelia sat with Richard in the quiet of the nursery, the paper between them, the air thick with everything unspoken. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I swear I didn't know he wrote this." She believed him, of course she did, but the weight of the letter brought clarity she hadn't expected. Ethan had seen something in Richard she now saw for herself, a partner, a protector, a man who loved not just her, but her son, with every quiet gesture and unspoken vow. The next day, she drove alone to the small hill where Ethan was buried, the letter in her coat pocket, the air crisp and clean around her. She stood for a long while before the grave, not crying this time, but speaking gently. "I think you always knew, didn't you, that if you couldn't be here, he would be. You saw something in us before we ever saw it ourselves." She pulled the letter from her pocket, pressed it gently to the cold stone, and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me to choose. I'm going to be okay. We are going to be okay." By the time she returned home, her mind was clear. She found Richard in the kitchen, humming as he fed Ethan in his high chair, the baby giggling with every spoonful, and the sight of them together brought tears to her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming beauty of a love she had nearly missed. She stepped forward, took the spoon from Richard's hand, and kissed him fully, her hands cupping his face as Ethan clapped behind them in joyful confusion. "I love you," she said quietly. "I've known it for a while, but I needed to feel it in my bones, not just my heart. And now I do." Richard didn't speak at first, only pulled her into an embrace so steady it felt like home, then whispered, "I've loved you since the day you stood in that courtroom and refused to let anyone erase your son. You are the bravest woman I've ever met." That night, as they tucked Ethan into bed and returned to the living room, Richard reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. It wasn't new. The edges were worn, the ribbon frayed, and she recognized it instantly. It was Ethan's, the same one his aunt had once given her, the sapphire pendant still inside. "I kept it because I wanted you to decide when you were ready to wear it again, not just as a memory, but as a promise." She took it, placed it around her neck, and smiled through tears. "Then let's make that promise together." The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the bedroom, casting golden lines across the soft bedding as Amelia stirred quietly. The warmth of little Ethan curled beside her, and the steady rhythm of Richard's breath just behind her. Everything felt still, yet full, like the world itself was pausing to honor this final moment of peace before the next chapter began. It had been 6 months since she said yes to his unspoken proposal. 6 months since she stopped surviving and started living fully. And now, as they prepared for a small, intimate wedding in the backyard beneath the magnolia tree, there was nothing grand or loud about it, only honest joy shared among those who had stayed, those who had truly mattered. The grass was freshly trimmed, white folding chairs placed in neat rows, and Amelia's mother hummed in the kitchen while laying out simple plates of lemon cake and tea sandwiches, her hands sure and steady, as if this had been waiting in her bones all along. Amelia dressed slowly, not in silk or satin, but in a soft cream gown that hugged her gently and carried no weight but memory. Her fingers lingered for a moment on the sapphire pendant around her neck, now worn not as a relic of what was lost, but as celebration of all that had survived. When she stepped into the garden, the hush that fell over the guests was not of awe but of respect, of deep quiet love for a woman who had walked through fire and come out softer, not harder, warmer, not colder. And when Richard turned to see her, his smile broke wide across his face, and he didn't wait for permission, simply stepped forward and took her hand in both of his, as if to say, "We made it, and now we begin again." The ceremony was short, spoken in clear vows written late at night in the corners of notebooks, promises not of perfection, but of presence, not of grandeur, but of grounding. And when they were pronounced husband and wife, the cheers that erupted felt like thunder rolling across years of silence. Every hand clap a release of something long held in. Little Ethan squealed in his grandmother's arms, clapping along as if he knew exactly what had happened, his baby laughter rising above the noise, bright and true and full of everything they had fought to give him. That evening, after the guests had gone and the house had quieted into stillness again, Amelia stepped out into the backyard, where the fairy light still twinkled above the empty chairs, and the scent of jasmine drifted through the air, like a whispered benediction. She stood beneath the magnolia tree, now draped with ribbons and soft white flowers, and let the silence sink in. Richard joined her minutes later, slipping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. No words passed between them for a long while, only breath and presence and the quiet heartbeat of contentment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "I used to think love was about fixing what was broken, but you taught me it's about building something new with what remains." She turned to face him, her fingers brushing his cheek. "I used to think love was just a moment, but now I know it's a choice we make every day, especially on the hard ones." In the days that followed, their lives unfolded with simple grace. Mornings began with baby giggles and shared coffee, afternoons spent in parks and bookstores, evenings tucked into each other as the fire crackled and time slowed. Amelia started a small writing studio in the neighborhood, helping other women shape their stories into memoirs and essays, giving voice to those who had been silenced by grief or shame or uncertainty. Richard returned to business not as a man chasing numbers, but as someone who now understood legacy in a deeper way. Each decision rooted not in profit but in purpose, and together they raised Ethan, not with pressure or perfection, but with love, so consistent it became the air he breathed. One spring afternoon, as they sat on a bench overlooking the Hudson, Ethan now walking and babbling beside their feet, Amelia turned to Richard and asked the question that had been resting quietly in her for some time. "Do you ever think about him? About Ethan Carter? About how this all started with him?" Richard nodded, his eyes on the river. I think about him often. Not with regret, but with gratitude. Without him, I never would have found you, and I think he knew that in some way, maybe more than we did." Amelia exhaled, her gaze drifting to the boy chasing a butterfly in the grass. "I think he left us pieces of himself, not just through our son, but through the courage he passed on, the strength he awakened in me." Richard took her hand, his fingers warm and steady. "You didn't just survive him, Amelia. You honored him, and you carried him forward without letting him hold you back. That's not just strength, that's grace." As the sun dipped lower and the sky turned gold, Amelia pulled her son into her lap, holding him close as he rested his head against her chest. Her eyes lifted to the horizon, the past no longer a chain but a foundation beneath her, the future no longer a question mark but an open path. And for the first time in her life, she felt entirely free, not because life had spared her pain, but because she had learned how to turn pain into something beautiful. Their story wasn't perfect, no story ever is, but it was real, and it was theirs, born from loss and shaped by love and carried forward by choice. Ethan Carter had once begged for a single night to leave behind a legacy, and in the end that night became the beginning of a life none of them could have predicted. A life filled with second chances, quiet bravery, and a kind of love that doesn't shout but stays, that doesn't demand but protects. And as Amelia whispered goodnight to her son that evening and turned off the light, she smiled softly to herself, knowing one truth more than any other. Love doesn't always arrive the way we expect it, but when it's real, when it's earned and chosen and cared for, it builds something eternal. And in that truth, Amelia had found her forever.